Dawn breaks over London, 1850. Queen Victoria stands at her palace window, examining a freshly arrived dispatch from India. 3 weeks by sea it took to reach her, and already the news is outdated. She knows this pace of communication won't suffice for the empire she envisions, an empire where British steam engines thunder across continents and telegraph cables span oceans. Across the world, as London's evening shadows lengthen, morning sun illuminates a very different palace in Kyoto. A young Emperor Meiji kneels before his advisors, listening to urgent reports of foreign ships in Japanese waters. Their steam-powered vessels and advanced weapons have forced open Japan's closed doors. But in this threat, the emperor sees opportunity, a chance to forge a new kind of empire that marries Eastern wisdom with Western might. These two monarchs never met. They ruled from opposite ends of the earth, guided by radically different traditions. Yet, in the span of a single generation, they would both orchestrate transformations so profound they would permanently reshape the global balance of power. Victoria would expand British influence until her empire encompassed a quarter of the world's land and people. Meiji would pull Japan from medieval isolation into industrial modernity with such speed that historians still marvel at the achievement. Their stories mirror each other in fascinating ways. While Victoria projected British power outward, building an empire on which the sun never set, Meiji turned Japan's gaze inward, strengthening his nation to resist the very imperialism Victoria championed. As Victoria's railways and telegraphs stitched together an empire, Meiji's factories and shipyards forged a nation strong enough to stand against one. Through their eyes, we'll witness an age of unprecedented change, when steam power and telegraph lines were shrinking the globe, when ancient traditions clashed with industrial might, and when two visionary monarchs, one in London, one in Kyoto, orchestrated transformations that would forever alter the course of history. The thundering of steam engines echoed across continents in 1850, heralding an age of unprecedented change. In London's factories, coal-blackened workers fed the furnaces of British industry. In Edo's quiet harbors, Japanese fishermen watched the horizon with growing unease, wary of foreign ships that would soon appear like specters from another world. Between these two distant shores, the fate of empires hung in the balance. The British Empire stood at its zenith, a colossus straddling the globe. Its network of colonies, trading posts, and military outposts formed an intricate web that transformed one small island nation into history's largest empire. The engine of this expansion was Britain's industrial might, the first of its kind in world history. Steam-powered factories in Manchester and Birmingham devoured raw materials from India's cotton fields and Africa's mines, converting them into manufactured goods that flooded markets from Shanghai to Santiago. This industrial revolution demanded more than materials. It required new systems of organization, communication, and control. Britain's response was to create an unprecedented imperial infrastructure. A web of railways spanning India's vast expanses, telegraph lines crossing ocean floors, and standardized administrative systems that governed everything from Hong Kong's harbors to Caribbean plantations. Each innovation served dual purposes: extracting resources more efficiently while binding the empire's distant territories more tightly to London's control. Meanwhile, across the world, Japan maintained its careful isolation. For over 2 centuries, the Tokugawa shogunate had preserved this separation through the Sakoku policy, allowing only minimal contact with the outside world through a single Dutch trading post at Nagasaki. This isolation had created a unique society. While Britain's cities roared with industrial activity, Japan's craftsmen still practiced centuries-old traditions. Its samurai carried swords rather than rifles, and its economy operated on principles that would have been familiar to their ancestors generations before. But history would not permit Japan's isolation to continue. In 1853, the decisive moment arrived in Tokyo Bay with Commodore Matthew Perry's Black ships. Their steam-powered bulk and advanced weaponry presented Japan with an unmistakable message: adapt or be dominated. The American flotilla represented not just military power, but a new world order where industrial might determined a nation's fate. Perry's arrival sparked a crisis within Japan's ruling class. The shogunate's inability to prevent this intrusion exposed its weakness, leading to intense internal debate about Japan's future. Traditional forces advocated resistance, while a growing faction recognized that Japan's survival required radical change. This tension would ultimately reshape Japanese society from its foundations. The modernization imperative facing both societies manifested differently. Britain's challenge was to maintain and expand its industrial advantage, requiring constant innovation and imperial expansion. The empire needed new markets for its goods, new sources of raw materials, and new territories to maintain its strategic position. This drive for expansion brought Britain into competition with other European powers, creating a complex web of international rivalries. Japan's challenge was more fundamental: to compress centuries of industrial development into decades while maintaining its independence and cultural identity. This would require not just adopting Western technology, but transforming Japanese society itself. Its military, education system, economy, and governance structure would all need radical reform. Both nations faced the central question of their era: how to adapt to a world where industrial power increasingly determined national destiny. Britain sought to maintain its position at the forefront of this new order, while Japan raced to catch up before it could be subjugated by Western powers. Their responses would be led by two monarchs whose reigns would define the age: Queen Victoria and Emperor Meiji. The stage was set for parallel transformations that would reshape the global balance of power. Victoria would oversee Britain's industrial empire at its height, while Meiji would guide Japan's metamorphosis from feudal society to modern power. Their stories, though separated by vast distances, would become inextricably linked in the great drama of 19th-century modernization. The choices these rulers made would echo far beyond their own time, establishing patterns of development, imperialism, and resistance that would shape the modern world. Through their reigns, we witness not just the story of two nations, but the birth of our contemporary global order, with all its technological marvels and inherent contradictions. In the spring of 1837, an 18-year-old girl stood before the Privy Council at Kensington Palace, her hands trembling slightly as she read her accession speech. Few among the assembled lords and ministers could have predicted that this diminutive figure, Princess Alexandrina Victoria, would become the figurehead of history's largest empire. Victoria's path to that moment had been shaped by isolation. Born in 1819 to the Duke and Duchess of Kent, she spent her childhood under the notorious Kensington system, a suffocating regime of constant surveillance and control devised by her mother and her mother's comptroller, Sir John Conroy. Every hour of her day was scheduled, every interaction monitored, every friendship scrutinized. She slept in her mother's room until the day she became queen. Her mail was censored, and she was never allowed to descend stairs without holding someone's hand. This claustrophobic upbringing forged an iron will. In her private diary, the young Victoria wrote, "I shall not be the puppet they mean me to be." Within hours of learning of her uncle William IV's death, she asserted her independence by moving her bed out of her mother's room. Her first act as queen was to demand an hour alone, something she had never been granted in all her 18 years. Victoria's early reign challenged expectations. She threw herself into state papers with unexpected vigor, working late into the night studying dispatches and policy documents. Her natural intelligence, combined with guidance from Lord Melbourne, her first prime minister and mentor, quickly gave her a commanding grasp of government operations. Melbourne later remarked to his sister, "I've never seen anyone who took to it so naturally. She was born to rule if ever anyone was." The arrival of Prince Albert in 1840 marked both a personal and political watershed. Their marriage transcended romance to become an intellectual partnership that would reshape the empire. Albert brought not only German efficiency, but a revolutionary vision of monarchy's role in the industrial age. His passion for science and technology transformed Victoria's own worldview. Where she had once viewed progress mainly through political and imperial lenses, Albert helped her see the transformative potential of education, urban reform, and technological innovation. Under Albert's influence, Victoria became an advocate for public health initiatives, educational reform, and the modernization of royal residences with new technologies. Together, they championed scientific advancement and industrial innovation, seeing Britain's technological prowess as key to its imperial future. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed in the revolutionary Crystal Palace, emerged from this shared vision of Britain's technological destiny, showcasing the nation's industrial might to the world. Behind the scenes, Victoria and Albert faced the complexities of governing an expanding empire. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 forced a fundamental reassessment of colonial administration. Victoria's response revealed the paradoxes of imperial rule. While she advocated harsh punishment for the rebels, she also pushed for reforms in the East India Company's governance and opposed racial discrimination in imperial administration. Her assumption of the title Empress of India in 1876, marked a new phase in British imperial ideology, one that attempted to bind colony and crown in direct personal union. The Queen's private writings from this period reveal someone grappling with the moral implications of empire. In an 1858 letter to Lord Canning, she wrote, "The Queen would be glad if her name could be associated with a new approach to governing our Indian subjects, one that promotes their welfare while securing British interests. This tension between benevolent rhetoric and imperial control would define her reign." Albert's death in 1861 devastated Victoria personally, but paradoxically strengthened her public image. Her intense mourning transformed her into a symbol of devotion and duty that resonated deeply with Victorian social values. Though she retreated from public view, her influence on policy remained substantial, particularly in foreign affairs and imperial administration. The technological innovations she'd embraced under Albert's influence, from railways to telegraphs, continued to shape her vision of empire, even in her grief. Victoria's later years saw her emerge as a different kind of monarch. Her relationship with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli added a new dimension to British imperialism, as he cultivated her enthusiasm for empire while expanding British influence in Africa and Asia. The Queen's journals from this period show increasing confidence in wielding soft power, using royal pageantry and personal diplomacy to reinforce imperial authority. One of the most remarkable aspects of Victoria's reign was her ability to adapt the monarchy to industrial age demands. She embraced new technologies, becoming the first monarch to ride a train, use a telephone, and be photographed. These symbolic acts helped position the crown as a modernizing force while maintaining its traditional authority. Each technological advancement she adopted seemed to shrink the vast distances of her empire, creating new possibilities for imperial governance. Yet Victoria remained full of contradictions. The woman who ruled the world's largest empire opposed women's suffrage. The Queen, who championed family values, maintained questionable relationships with her servants John Brown and Abdul Karim, challenging the very social conventions her era was known for. Her friendship with Karim, her Indian teacher or Munshi, particularly scandalized the court, but reflected her genuine, if paternalistic, interest in her colonial subjects. Victoria died in 1901, having defined an age. Her reign had witnessed Britain's transformation from a European power into a global empire, from an agricultural society into an industrial giant. The technological innovations she'd embraced under Albert's influence had shrunk the vast distances of her empire, creating new possibilities and challenges for imperial rule. She left behind not just an imperial system that would shape the 20th century, but a model of monarchy adapted to the industrial age. As Britain's power reached its zenith under Victoria's reign, across the world another young monarch faced a different imperial challenge. In Japan, Emperor Meiji was preparing to guide his nation through an equally dramatic transformation, one that would challenge the very foundations of Western imperial dominance that Victoria had helped establish. On a cold November morning in 1852, in Kyoto's secluded imperial palace, a child was born who would reshape a nation. Named Mutsuhito, later to become Emperor Meiji, he entered a Japan frozen in time, a land where samurai still walked the streets with their twin swords, where foreign ideas were banned, and where the emperor himself was considered too sacred to set foot upon the ground. Behind the palace's ancient walls, young Mutsuhito's world was defined by shadows and whispers. As he knelt before scrolls of thousand-year-old Chinese classics, steam engines were revolutionizing transport across Europe. While he practiced the precise brushstrokes of classical calligraphy, telegraphs were spanning continents. In his secluded garden, where every step was governed by centuries of tradition, he remained untouched by the industrial age transforming the outside world, a world he could scarcely imagine existed. The Japan of Meiji's childhood existed in deliberate isolation. While Victoria's Britain hummed with industrial activity, the Tokugawa shogunate maintained an almost medieval society. Foreign books were prohibited, overseas travel was punishable by death, and technological advancement had essentially paused. The young prince, raised behind the vermilion walls of Kyoto's imperial palace, had no concept of the industrialized world that would soon force its way into Japan's carefully maintained seclusion. Mutsuhito's early education reflected this isolation. His tutors schooled him in classical Chinese literature, traditional poetry, and the intricate ceremonies that had governed imperial life for centuries. Each day began with ritual prayers and ended with formal recitations, his life bound by traditions that stretched back 1,000 years. A courtier's diary from this period describes the young prince as serious beyond his years, with a quietness that speaks of deep waters. The catalyst for change came in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships appeared in Edo Bay. Their steam-powered bulk and advanced weaponry presented Japan's rulers with an unmistakable message: adapt or be subjugated. The young prince, though sheltered from direct knowledge of these events, would have sensed the tension that radiated through the imperial court. His father, Emperor Meiji, strongly opposed opening Japan to foreign influence, but the shogunate's inability to resist Perry's demands exposed the weakness of Japan's isolation. In 1867, at just 15, Mutsuhito ascended to the throne as Emperor Meiji. Within months, he found himself at the center of a revolution. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 overthrew the shogunate that had ruled Japan for centuries, theoretically returning power to the emperor. In reality, a group of forward-thinking samurai and court nobles saw in the young emperor an opportunity to modernize Japan on their own terms. Meiji's personal transformation mirrored Japan's metamorphosis. His first bold step was moving the imperial capital from Kyoto to Edo, renamed Tokyo, Eastern capital. This physical journey symbolized Japan's larger transition, breaking with tradition to forge a new path. In a radical departure from imperial custom, Meiji began appearing in public, letting his subjects see their emperor's face for the first time in centuries. A witness to his first public procession wrote, "The people wept to see him, not as a distant god, but as a living emperor who walked among them." The emperor's adoption of Western dress became a powerful symbol of Japan's transformation. In formal portraits, he appeared in military uniforms inspired by European designs, while maintaining traditional robes for Shinto ceremonies. When he cut off his traditional top-knot hairstyle, many Japanese followed suit. A courtier recorded his reaction. The emperor's hair fell, and with it, centuries of tradition. Yet this was no mere symbolic gesture. Meiji understood that modernization required more than surface changes. Private documents reveal his active engagement in policy decisions. He voraciously consumed reports on Western technology, military organization, and educational systems. When advised about the importance of railways for modern nations, he not only approved their construction, but insisted on riding the first train himself, a profound shock to courtiers who traditionally believed the emperor too sacred to set foot on the ground. His personal physician recorded, "His Majesty showed no fear, only fascination with the machine's workings. He asked endless questions about its operation." The emperor supported Japan's rapid industrialization with remarkable pragmatism. He endorsed the famous Charter Oath of 1868, declaring that knowledge shall be sought throughout the world. Under this mandate, Japan dispatched the Iwakura Mission, a group of high-ranking officials who spent 2 years studying Western institutions. Their findings shaped Japan's modernization policies, from education to industry to military organization. Meiji personally reviewed their reports, often annotating them with questions and suggestions. Perhaps Meiji's most dramatic decision was supporting the abolition of the samurai class. The warriors who had once been Japan's military elite saw their privileges stripped away, their sword-wearing rights revoked, and their stipends eliminated. When the Satsuma Rebellion erupted in 1877, led by former samurai, Meiji stood firm. The rebellion's suppression by Japan's new conscript army marked the definitive end of the samurai era. In his private diary, Meiji wrote, "The way forward requires difficult choices. We cannot hold to the past while reaching for the future." Education became a cornerstone of Meiji's modernization strategy. He transformed his own study room into a symbol of learning, filling it with foreign books and scientific instruments. The imperial rescript on education, issued in his name, established a national education system that combined Western knowledge with Japanese values. By the end of his reign, Japan had achieved near-universal literacy, a remarkable feat for a nation that had been largely feudal just decades earlier. Meiji's diplomatic acumen proved crucial to Japan's transformation. He carefully balanced modernization with tradition, maintaining essential Shinto rituals while embracing Western diplomatic practices. When hosting foreign dignitaries, he would wear Western military uniforms, but for domestic ceremonies, he maintained traditional court dress. This dual approach helped reassure both international powers and domestic traditionalists. A British diplomat noted, "The emperor appears to move effortlessly between two worlds, equally at home in both." More remarkably, Meiji pioneered a unique approach to international relations that became known as qualified emulation, adopting Western methods while firmly maintaining Japanese independence. He insisted that foreign advisors be hired on fixed contracts rather than given permanent positions, ensuring Japan retained control of its modernization. When Western powers pressed for extraterritorial rights and trade concessions, Meiji's government skillfully negotiated to limit these privileges and set clear timelines for their expiration. A French diplomat observed with grudging admiration, "The Japanese study our ways not to become like us, but to learn how to resist us." The emperor's personal interest in military modernization proved prescient. He supported the creation of a modern army and navy, often attending military reviews and naval demonstrations. Japan's victories in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894–95, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–05, validated these efforts, establishing Japan as Asia's first modern military power and the first non-Western nation to defeat a European empire. These victories transformed global perceptions of Japan and challenged assumptions about Western superiority. By the time of his death in 1912, Meiji had overseen Japan's transformation from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial and military power. The nation he left behind bore little resemblance to the one he had inherited. Japan now possessed a constitution, a parliament, a national education system, modern armed forces, and an industrial economy. Steam locomotives crossed the country, telegraph lines carried messages instantly, and Japanese-built battleships patrolled the seas. Yet even as Japan modernized, Meiji ensured it maintained its cultural identity. Unlike other non-Western nations that modernized through colonization, Japan charted its own course, adopting Western technologies while preserving its independence and much of its traditional culture. This unique synthesis, modern yet distinctly Japanese, would influence modernization efforts across Asia. In February 1885, two documents crossed paths somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Heading east was a British engineering report detailing railway construction in India. Traveling west was a Japanese diplomatic assessment of British industrial methods. Neither Victoria nor Meiji knew of these specific papers, yet they perfectly captured how their paths had become intertwined. Britain exporting expertise, while Japan carefully studied Western methods. Their approaches to modernization emerged from radically different circumstances. Victoria inherited an empire already transforming through industrial power. Her private papers from 1851 reflect this position of strength. Albert says our great exhibition shall show all nations their dependence upon us. Meanwhile, Meiji's government faced an existential challenge. A cabinet memorandum from 1872 captured their urgency. We have but months to accomplish what the West achieved in centuries. These contrasting positions shaped how each monarch approached governance. Victoria worked through existing institutions, gradually adapting them to industrial age demands. She maintained traditional ceremonies while embracing symbolic modernization, riding trains, using telegraphs, being photographed. The Times noted in 1867, "Her Majesty shows how ancient dignity and modern progress may coexist." Meiji, by necessity, took a more radical approach. Rather than gradual adaptation, he orchestrated a complete restructuring of Japanese society. When he moved the imperial capital to Tokyo in 1868, he was not just changing locations, he was symbolically breaking with centuries of tradition. A court official wrote, "In one step, the emperor has crossed from ancient to modern times." Their methods of acquiring expertise differed markedly. Victoria's Britain exported knowledge, sending engineers and administrators throughout its empire. British experts built railways in India, established banks in Hong Kong, and designed ports in Singapore. This created what one official called a web of British expertise spanning the globe. Meiji's Japan, conversely, carefully imported knowledge. Foreign experts were hired on fixed contracts, while Japanese students were sent abroad to learn. An 1870 government directive specified, "We shall learn from the West, but we shall not be taught by the West." This distinction proved crucial. Japan maintained control of its modernization process rather than submitting to foreign direction. The monarch's approaches to military modernization revealed similar contrasts. Victoria oversaw the gradual evolution of Britain's existing military strength, particularly its navy. Military reforms came methodically, building on established foundations. An 1860 Admiralty report noted, We maintain our superiority through constant refinement. Meiji's military transformation was more fundamental. Japan's armed forces underwent complete reformation, from a samurai-based system to a modern military in less than a generation. When the last samurai rebellion was crushed in 1877, a French military observer wrote, "They have accomplished in 9 years what took Europe a century." Education proved another crucial battleground. Victoria supported the expansion of existing educational institutions, championing technical education and scientific advancement. The establishment of new universities and research institutions built upon Britain's scholarly tradition. Prince Albert wrote in 1846, "We must make knowledge more accessible, not reinvent how it is taught." Meiji faced the challenge of creating an entire national education system from scratch. The Imperial Rescript on Education of 1890 attempted something unprecedented, combining Western scientific knowledge with traditional Japanese values. A British diplomat observed, "They are not just building schools, they are forging a new way of thinking." Their handling of social tensions reflected their different circumstances. Victoria's Britain absorbed industrial change through existing social structures, though not without considerable strain. Labor reforms and social legislation came gradually, working within established systems. The Queen wrote in 1870, "Change must come at a pace society can bear." Meiji's Japan underwent more dramatic social reorganization. The abolition of the samurai class, the creation of new social hierarchies, the transformation of gender roles, all occurred within decades. A Japanese scholar wrote in 1880, "We are not merely reforming society, we are creating a new one." Economic strategies similarly reflected their different positions. Victoria's Britain focused on expanding global trade, establishing new markets, and securing resources for its industries. The empire provided both raw materials and markets, creating what Disraeli called a self-sustaining system of commerce. Meiji's Japan concentrated on building domestic industrial capacity and protecting economic independence. State-directed industrialization, strategic resource development, and careful market controls characterized this approach. An 1884 economic report stated, "We must build our strength before we can compete as equals." By the 1890s, these different paths began to intersect in fascinating ways. Japanese students studied in British universities, while British observers studied Japanese manufacturing methods. Victoria's government, initially skeptical of Japan's modernization, found itself learning from Japanese efficiency techniques. A British factory inspector wrote in 1896, "They have taken our methods and in some ways improved upon them." Communication technologies revealed similar patterns of adaptation. Victoria used telegraph networks to bind her empire together, creating what she called instantaneous connection across the seas. Meiji employed the same technologies but focused them inward, using them to centralize control over Japan's modernization. As their reigns drew to a close, both monarchs had demonstrated that modernization need not follow a single path. Victoria showed how an existing power could adapt to accelerating change while maintaining its institutions. Meiji proved that a nation could rapidly modernize without losing its cultural essence. Together, they established that the journey to modernity could follow different routes while reaching similar destinations. When Emperor Meiji died in 1912, 11 years after Victoria's passing, the world had entered an age fundamentally shaped by their transformative reigns. Their distinct approaches to modernization had created not just two powerful nations, but two competing models of development that would influence the entire 20th century. Britain's industrial system became the blueprint for Western modernization. By 1914, British standards defined modern industry, from railway gauges to manufacturing processes. German industrialist Friedrich Krupp observed, "The British have created not just an industrial empire, but the very language of industrial society. When we speak of standardization, efficiency, or mass production, we speak in concepts Britain defined." British technical education, factory organization, and industrial practices became global standards that even its rivals adopted. The influence of Victorian institutions proved equally profound. British parliamentary procedures shaped governments from Canada to Australia. Civil service examinations based on the British model were adopted across continents. A French administrative reformer noted in 1920, "The British gift to modern governance was not just democracy, but bureaucracy, the systems that make modern states function." These administrative structures would survive long after the empire's decline. Japan's achievement offered a radically different template. Meiji's model of selective modernization, carefully choosing which Western elements to adopt while maintaining cultural independence, became a powerful example for non-Western nations. When Iran began modernizing in the 1920s, its leaders explicitly studied the Japanese example. China's Sun Yat-sen declared in 1924, "Japan has shown us the path, how to learn from the West without being colonized by it." The economic systems they established created competing models of development. Britain's free market imperialism contrasted sharply with Japan's state-directed industrialization. This fundamental tension between market-driven and state-guided development would shape economic debates throughout the 20th century. When South Korea and Singapore embarked on their economic miracles in the 1960s, they drew heavily from the Meiji model of state-coordinated modernization. Their influence on education systems proved particularly far-reaching. The Victorian model of public education, emphasizing practical knowledge and scientific thinking, shaped schools across the English-speaking world. Meanwhile, Meiji's integration of modern technical education with traditional values influenced educational reforms across Asia. By 1950, Japan's near-universal literacy rates had become a standard that developing nations aspired to achieve. However, their successes also contained seeds of future conflicts. The industrial and military capabilities they developed contributed directly to the arms race preceding World War I. A prescient American diplomat wrote in 1915, "The very forces Victoria and Meiji mastered, industrial might, nationalist pride, military power, have set the great nations on a collision course." The technologies they championed, steel warships, rapid-fire weapons, railway networks, would transform warfare with devastating consequences. Their approaches to cultural adaptation established enduring patterns. Victoria's Britain demonstrated how traditional institutions could absorb radical technological change while maintaining stability. Meiji's Japan proved that rapid modernization need not mean westernization. When India gained independence in 1947, its leaders consciously attempted to blend these approaches, seeking to modernize while preserving cultural identity. The communication revolution they initiated, from telegraph networks to mass printing, created new patterns of global interaction that foreshadowed our digital age. The first undersea telegraph cables laid during Victoria's reign began the process of global interconnection that defines our modern world. Meiji's systematic translation of Western scientific works into Japanese created a model of knowledge transfer that developing nations would later follow. Their influence on concepts of national identity proved especially significant. Victorian Britain developed an identity that merged industrial might with imperial purpose, while Meiji's Japan created a nationalism that combined technological progress with cultural preservation. These different models of national development would influence independence movements throughout the decolonization era. In the realm of international relations, their legacies established lasting patterns. Victoria's projection of British power through trade and cultural influence created a model of soft power diplomacy that continues to shape international relations. Meiji's careful balancing of international engagement with national independence offered lessons about maintaining sovereignty in an interconnected world. Their impact on urban development and infrastructure continues to shape our cities. Victorian engineering standards influenced everything from sewage systems to public transportation networks worldwide. Japanese urban planning, which combined modern efficiency with traditional aesthetics, created models that rapidly developing Asian cities would later adopt. Perhaps most remarkably, their insights about managing technological change remain relevant in our digital age. Both demonstrated that successful modernization requires more than merely adopting new technologies. It demands careful attention to social stability and cultural continuity. As artificial intelligence and genetic engineering transform our world, their examples offer crucial lessons about balancing innovation with stability. A Silicon Valley executive observed in 2020, "The challenges Victoria and Meiji faced, how to adopt transformative technologies without disrupting social cohesion, mirror our struggles with AI and automation. Their solutions, though from a different era, remain surprisingly relevant." Their experiences with managing disruptive change offer valuable insights for modern leaders grappling with technological revolution. The world they helped create, interconnected, industrialized, and in constant flux, is still fundamentally our world. Their insights about balancing progress with stability, innovation with tradition, and global engagement with cultural preservation remain vital to contemporary challenges. As nations today face pressure to modernize their economies, educational systems, and technological infrastructure, the paths blazed by Victoria and Meiji offer crucial lessons about managing transformative change. Their most enduring legacy may be the demonstration that modernization can follow different paths while achieving similar goals. As developing nations today seek their own routes to modernity, and as established powers grapple with technological disruption, this insight remains powerful. That successful adaptation to change requires neither blind embrace of the new nor rigid adherence to the old, but rather the wisdom to blend innovation with tradition, progress with stability, and global engagement with cultural preservation. Today's leaders, facing challenges from climate change to artificial intelligence, would do well to remember how these two monarchs navigated their own era of transformation. Their examples remind us that even the most dramatic changes can be managed successfully if leaders understand that progress must be anchored in human values and cultural continuity. This may be their most valuable lesson for our age of accelerating change. As Meiji's Japan emerged as a powerful, independent nation, the global balance of power began to shift. Victoria's Britain, which had dominated the 19th century through industrial might and naval power, now faced a rising Asian empire that had mastered the very tools of modernity that Britain had pioneered. Meiji's vision had not only transformed Japan, but had helped usher in a new age of global competition and cultural exchange, an age that would reshape the coming century.